Elon Musk walked into the calculus classroom, unassuming and quiet, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Professor Jacobs had a reputation for calling students out and embarrassing them in front of the whole class. Today, he seemed especially ready for something. He looked around the room with a sharp eye and then, out of nowhere, he saw Elon sitting in the middle row. A smirk crossed his face. "Mr. Musk, isn't it?" Professor Jacobs said loudly, making the room go silent. Everyone turned to see who he was talking to. Elon just nodded, trying to remain calm. He had no idea what was about to happen. The professor's eyes sparkled with mischief. He leaned against the whiteboard, his arms crossed. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you, Mr. Musk? I mean, after all, you're Elon Musk, right? The man who sends rockets into space and makes electric cars. Well, let's see how good you are at calculus." The students all turned towards Elon, their eyes wide with curiosity. They had no idea that the man sitting among them was capable of more than just making billion-dollar companies. Professor Jacobs was about to find out the hard way, but he had no idea. The professor began writing a complex equation on the board, filled with integrals, limits, and variables most students had never seen before. He smiled to himself, knowing this equation would stump even the best student. "Solve this," he said, turning to Elon. "Let's see if the so-called genius can handle a real challenge." Elon stayed calm, his eyes fixed on the board. Little did the professor know, math was more than just numbers to Elon, it was like second nature. The classroom waited, tense and silent, wondering if this would be the moment when Elon Musk would finally meet his match. Elon stood up slowly, looking at the equation without any panic. The professor's smirk grew wider. "Take your time, Mr. Musk. We've got all day," he sneered, making a few students chuckle nervously. Most of the class had seen their fair share of students get humiliated by Professor Jacobs, but today felt different. Elon took a deep breath, then picked up a marker from the professor's desk. Without saying a word, he walked up to the board. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Elon began writing. But what was even more surprising wasn't just that he started solving the problem, it was the way he did it. His movements were swift but precise. The markers squeaked as Elon filled the board with his solution, step by step. The tension in the room rose as everyone leaned forward, trying to follow what he was doing. Even the professor, who had started this whole scene with a smirk, began to furrow his brow in confusion. He wasn't expecting Elon to actually tackle the problem this way, so confidently, so easily. As Elon reached the end of the equation, a few students gasped. The solution was elegant, simple, and correct. Elon capped the marker and turned to face the professor, who was now standing frozen in place, his mouth slightly open. The class burst into murmurs, shocked at what they had just witnessed. Professor Jacobs was known for his complex problems, the kind that no student could solve on their first try. And here was Elon Musk, calmly walking back to his seat as if it were nothing. "Impossible," the professor muttered under his breath, stepping forward to double-check Elon's work. But there it was, perfectly solved, every step laid out clearly. He looked back at Elon, who sat quietly, his face calm, waiting for the professor's next move. Professor Jacobs wasn't the type to give up easily. His face turned red with embarrassment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Well, well, Mr. Musk, it seems you can handle basic calculus. But let's see if you're still that confident with something more challenging." He quickly erased the board and began writing another equation, this one even more complicated than the last. It was a real monster, something that would take most students days to figure out, if they could solve it at all. The professor stepped back, pleased with himself. "Let's see you solve this one, genius." The class waited again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. They had just witnessed Elon solve the first problem with ease, and now they were eager to see if he could do it again. Elon stood up once more, walking back to the board. He studied the problem for a moment, then without a word, he began solving it. This time, there were more steps involved, more twists and turns, but Elon moved through it as if it were second nature. His marker danced across the board, filling it with solutions that made the professor's eyes widen with disbelief. By the time Elon finished, the room was silent again. He capped the marker, turned around, and gave the professor a polite nod before heading back to his seat. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Professor Jacobs stood in front of the board, stunned. His own mind was racing, trying to figure out how someone, anyone, could solve such a problem so quickly. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Well, I suppose that's one way to do it," he said, trying to regain his authority. But the students weren't buying it. They could see the shock in the professor's eyes, and it was clear that Elon Musk had just pulled off something remarkable. And yet, Elon remained humble, sitting quietly, as if this whole ordeal was just another normal day for him. Professor Jacobs was now visibly rattled. His calm, superior attitude had vanished, replaced by frustration and embarrassment. He could feel the eyes of the students on him, and it only made his temper flare. He had never been challenged like this before, especially by someone who wasn't even a full-time student. Desperate to regain control of the situation, he clapped his hands loudly, trying to shake off the growing tension in the room. "All right, everyone. Settle down," he snapped, though it was more of a command than a suggestion. "I see Mr. Musk has some familiarity with math. But mathematics is more than solving equations. It's about understanding the deeper principles behind them. Anyone can memorize formulas and techniques, but true understanding, well, that's something else entirely." He began pacing in front of the classroom, his voice rising as he spoke. "I'll ask you this, Mr. Musk. Can you explain why the solution you gave works? Let's hear your understanding of the mathematical principles behind your calculations. Anyone can scribble numbers on a board, but can you explain them?" The professor thought he had finally cornered Elon, expecting him to falter. But Elon remained composed. Without missing a beat, he stood up once again, but this time, instead of heading to the board, he turned to face the class. "Mathematics isn't about memorizing formulas or just solving problems mechanically," Elon began, his voice calm and measured. "It's about patterns, logic, and problem-solving at its core. For example, the equation the professor just gave us isn't just a bunch of symbols. It's a representation of a much deeper concept, a way to model real-world phenomena. If you understand that, then the solution becomes clear." Elon went on to explain the problem in simple terms, breaking it down piece by piece, making it easy for everyone in the room to follow. His explanation was so clear, so logical, that even the students who had been completely lost in calculus before began to nod along in understanding. He wasn't just solving problems, he was teaching the class in a way the professor never had. As Elon spoke, something unexpected happened. The students, who had always feared Professor Jacobs' brutal teaching style, began to see him in a new light. They had always been too scared to question his methods, too intimidated by his reputation to challenge him. But now, with Elon standing there, calmly explaining calculus in a way that made sense to everyone, the professor's authority started to crumble. Whispers began to spread through the classroom. Students were exchanging glances, nodding, and even scribbling down notes from Elon's explanation. It was clear they were learning more from this one moment than they had from weeks of Professor Jacobs' lectures. The professor noticed the shift in the room and grew even more frustrated. He slammed his hand down on his desk, causing a few students to jump. "Enough!" he barked, his face red with anger. "This is my classroom, and I decide how things are done here." He turned to Elon, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You may think you're clever, Mr. Musk, but this is just a distraction. Real learning doesn't happen by showing off or making things look easy. It happens through discipline, hard work, and years of study. You've had your moment, now let's get back to the real work." The tension in the room was palpable. Professor Jacobs was desperately trying to regain control, but the students weren't as easily convinced as before. They had seen the difference between Elon's calm, clear explanations and the professor's harsh, intimidating style. And they were starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, the professor didn't know everything after all. Unwilling to let the professor's words go unchallenged, one brave student raised their hand. "But Professor," the student said hesitantly, "if Elon's explanations make sense, isn't that part of the learning process too? Shouldn't we understand why we're solving these problems instead of just memorizing formulas?" The room went silent. The professor stared at the student, his eyes narrowing in anger. "That's enough," he snapped. "This is not a debate. I've been teaching calculus for longer than you've been alive, and I know what works. If you want to succeed in this class, you'll do as I say. Now, let's move on." But the students weren't backing down. Another hand shot up, followed by another. "Can Elon explain more?" one student asked. "I actually understood what he was saying for the first time," said another. The professor's face flushed with anger. He was losing control, and he knew it. "Enough," he shouted. "This is my classroom, and we will do things my way." But even as he spoke, the students were already looking to Elon for answers. The professor could feel his authority slipping away, and in a desperate move, he turned to Elon once more. "All right, Mr. Musk," he said through gritted teeth. "Since you're so confident, how about a final challenge? Something truly advanced, something that separates the real mathematicians from the amateurs." He began scribbling on the board again, faster this time, creating a monstrous equation that stretched across the entire whiteboard. It was a problem that even professional mathematicians would struggle with, filled with complex functions, variables, and multiple layers of abstraction. It was, in the professor's mind, unsolvable. "Let's see you solve this," he said, stepping back with a satisfied grin. Elon looked at the equation for a moment, his expression calm. The students held their breath, wondering if this would be the moment when Elon finally met his match. The professor stood at the front, arms crossed, confident that this would be the end of Elon's streak. But instead of looking worried, Elon smiled. He picked up the marker once again and started writing on the board. This time, his movements were even more fluid, more deliberate. The markers squeaked across the whiteboard as he worked through the problem step by step. It didn't take long. Within minutes, Elon had filled the board with his solution, breaking down the complex problem into simple, understandable steps. When he finally capped the marker and turned around, the room was silent. The professor's face had gone pale, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. Elon had done it. He had solved the unsolvable. The students erupted into applause, cheering for the man who had just proven that even the most challenging problems could be tackled with the right mindset. Elon, ever humble, simply smiled and took his seat, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Professor Jacobs stood there, speechless. He had tried to humiliate Elon Musk, but in the end it was he who had been humbled. The students, once intimidated and fearful, had learned a valuable lesson, that true genius doesn't come from belittling others or trying to assert dominance. It comes from understanding, humility, and the willingness to learn. And as for Elon, he had once again proven that his brilliance wasn't just limited to rockets or electric cars, it extended to every challenge he faced, even in the most unexpected places. The classroom settled after the applause, but the energy lingered. Elon had done something more profound than just solving an equation. He had sparked a shift in the minds of the students, a ripple effect that was about to change how they approached their studies, and perhaps how they viewed the world. The whispers started immediately after class let out. The students huddled together, buzzing with excitement. "Did you see what he did?" one student asked. "I've never seen Professor Jacobs like that," another added. They weren't just talking about Elon's math skills anymore. They were talking about the way he had carried himself, calm, confident, never condescending. In a world where intelligence often came off as intimidating, Elon had shown them that real brilliance didn't need to crush others to shine. Meanwhile, Professor Jacobs disappeared into his office, still reeling from the public humiliation. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head, Elon effortlessly breaking down the problem, the students rallying behind him, his own authority crumbling right in front of his eyes. For years, he had built his identity around being the smartest person in the room, the gatekeeper of knowledge. And yet, in a single afternoon, Elon had dismantled it all without even trying. He sat down at his desk, rubbing his temples, trying to make sense of what had happened. How had Elon, someone so far removed from academia, managed to outshine him in his own domain? It wasn't just the math, there was something deeper going on. A part of him felt a growing respect for Elon, despite the sting of defeat. Another part felt the weight of his pride pulling him down, refusing to accept what had just happened. Back in the classroom, students were gathering around Elon, asking questions, eager to hear more. "How do you think about math like that?" one of them asked. "You made it seem so easy." Elon, still humble, simply smiled and shrugged. "It's not about memorizing formulas," he said. "It's about understanding the logic behind them. Once you grasp the patterns, it all becomes a lot clearer." He paused, looking around at the eager faces, and added, "And don't let anyone make you feel small for not knowing something. The smartest people are the ones who never stop asking questions." The students nodded, absorbing every word. This wasn't the kind of lesson they were used to. It wasn't about grades or exams, or trying to impress the professor. It was about learning for the sake of understanding, for the sheer joy of discovery. Word of what had happened in the calculus class spread across the campus like wildfire. By the next day, everyone was talking about the mysterious man who had walked into Professor Jacobs' class and turned the entire lecture upside down. Some students exaggerated the story, adding their own dramatic twists, like how Elon had supposedly written the entire equation without looking at the board, or how he had solved an even more impossible problem that no one else could understand. But one thing remained consistent in every version of the story. Elon Musk, the billionaire tech genius, had come into their world and shown them that even the most intimidating subjects, like calculus, didn't have to be scary. That brilliance could be gentle, and learning could be exciting, not just a chore. As for Professor Jacobs, the event had forced him to reflect on his teaching method. For years, he had believed that strict discipline and rigorous challenges were the only way to make his students excel. But now, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. Maybe the key wasn't in forcing students to struggle, but in helping them see the beauty and simplicity behind the complexity. Weeks passed, and Professor Jacobs began to make subtle changes in his classroom. He started asking more open-ended questions, encouraging students to think about why certain methods worked instead of just memorizing them. He became less rigid in his approach, allowing for more discussion and, to everyone's surprise, more mistakes. He even found himself cracking a joke or two, something the students thought they would never see. The students noticed the difference immediately. They were more engaged, more willing to ask questions, and even more willing to admit when they didn't understand something. It was as if the tension that had once filled the classroom had been replaced with a sense of curiosity and collaboration. One afternoon, as the students were packing up their books, Professor Jacobs glanced at the back of the classroom where Elon had sat that fateful day. A small smile crept onto his face. He wasn't one to admit defeat easily, but in his heart, he knew that Elon had taught him something far more valuable than any equation. For Elon, the day in the calculus class had been just another moment in his life, a blip on his radar of endless projects and ventures. But for the students and Professor Jacobs, it had been transformative. It wasn't just about the math. It was about how they viewed learning, intelligence, and even themselves. Elon had walked into that classroom expecting a casual challenge, but had unknowingly sparked a change in how those students would approach their education from that day forward. They no longer saw calculus as an intimidating subject, nor did they see Professor Jacobs as the unapproachable figure he once was. In the weeks that followed, the students began to thrive. Their confidence grew, and so did their curiosity. They started seeing patterns not just in math but in life. They understood that learning wasn't about passing tests or impressing professors, it was about expanding their minds and seeing the world in new ways. As for Elon, he continued with his busy schedule, changing the world in his own way. He had no idea the impact he had left on that small classroom in that short period. But perhaps that was part of his genius, his ability to inspire change, even when he wasn't trying. And so, the story of the liberal calculus professor and Elon Musk spread far beyond the classroom. It became a tale of humility, learning, and the power of curiosity, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds are those who never stop asking questions, and that true genius is not about defeating others but lifting them up.